Welcome to another video in the How Do I Do Something in CloudBolt video series. My name is Mike Bombard. I'm one of the cloud architects on the pre-sales side of the house here at CloudBolt. And today we're going to be discussing how do I use custom forms in CloudBolt. So custom forms is a newer feature. It was introduced within the last 2 or 3 versions. So 2023.2.1, I believe, is when it hit its general availability. But the problem that we're working to solve with custom forms is self-service initiatives. We've seen a number of these fall apart at customers with some competitive products where the user experience really failed when it's not flexible enough to meet the customer's requirements. A big part to adopting self-service for an organization is the ability to ensure a good user experience. And if your users don't experience a good user experience, they're probably not going to adopt the automation processes that you're attempting to put in place. So this custom forms capability was really developed to address that usability perspective and make the catalog items you're requesting from CloudBolt extremely flexible. So we're going to be going through the custom forms allow a blueprint manager to define custom layouts, how to populate your fields, doing things like dynamic inputs, and really giving you total control over the look and feel of any form for a CloudBolt blueprint. So our agenda for today, we're going to be diving deep into custom forms, talk through an introduction. We'll get into some supported build items, so a little bit of some caveats you want to be aware of before you start working with these. Then we're going to get into auto-generated custom forms, which takes your existing blueprint and creates a custom form based off of what you already have so that you have a really good starting point, and then you can start to work with the layout of the form to make it really fit your requirements. So that's where we kind of transition into layout customization. Then we'll talk about input mapping and mapping your custom form values that are selected into parameter values on your CloudBolt blueprint. Then we'll get a little deeper. I think we spend quite a bit of time on generating options here. And these would be, there's a lot of different ways to generate what options the end user is able to select from. We want to make sure that their selections are governed appropriately, maybe even making dynamic decisions around what group they're submitting a request from. We can show them different options as a result of that. And we'll get into that in the video today. We're also going to talk through validation, making sure the forms have valid information that we're passing into CloudBolt, and then some additional examples. Look at some like dynamic matrices and things like that, where the forms build out a little more dynamically, and we can pass in an undefined number of examples in there. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So let's start talking about custom forms. The first place that I would go if you're trying to find out about custom forms is obviously going to be our documentation. A good portion of this video, we're just going to be walking through the portions of this documentation. So kind of following a logical flow through a lot of this. So let's talk about custom forms. They were first introduced in a GA format in 2023.2.1. So if you're on an older version of CloudBolt, you'll need to update your system before you can leverage this feature. So the big idea is it offers a low-code solution to create and configure totally custom order forms for blueprints. There's a lot of use cases that this makes a lot of sense for. One of the big ones that I've seen customers use this for is the dynamic capturing of input. So we'll run through an example towards the end of this video that shows how to allow the user to input potentially an unlimited number of inputs, and based off of what they've passed in on the order form, we're creating a dynamically created number of outputs that match their number of inputs. And it could be different inputs for every single object that they're attempting to create, things like that. So multiple server orders and things like that. So we'll talk through a lot of that as we get into this, but the other thing I'll point out here is this form configuration is stored as JSON, so it can be stored in your version control systems. It can be versioned. You can make different versions of the form. The JSON can be edited directly in the UI. The other thing I'll point out here is we're using a technology called Survey.js under the covers to build this custom form out. So if you've ever worked with Survey.js, this should be a really similar look and feel to other forms you've built in the past. There is a link to some really good documentation here around how to leverage Survey.js. So it is effectively forms as code, but there is a really good fully functional UI that's also built around this as well. So we'll be covering a lot of that as we get into the video. I'm not going to go through all of the documentation, but I think the first thing that I would like to call out before we get started is this build item limitation section. And maybe if you're watching this video down the road, just come back to the documentation, check to see if this has been updated in a future version. But the custom form is the auto generate feature currently has limited support for server tier build items. And a big portion of that is because of the way that we handle server tier items in CloudBolt. We're doing a lot of filtering as we go through and select environments, and then each environment has its own list of parameters and all of those kinds of things. You can still use a custom form for server tier build items, but the caveat there is that you'll need to manually create and configure each of those items inside of the form builder. And your environments probably should all be aligned with similar inputs or exactly the same inputs if you're trying to capture that same information. So while it is possible to use a custom form for server tier build items in the existing iteration, it's probably going to be a little bit more work than what we're able to do with some of the other build item types inside of CloudBolt. So, and that really comes down to when we get into this, you're going to see that there's an auto generate feature of custom forms that will build a default form for every single one of your blueprints for all of those build tier items, I believe, with the exception of server tier build items. So we'll dive in here and start to take a look at those things. Now we're going to take a look at a blueprint. I just started putting this together a little bit earlier. Just a very basic blueprint that has a single build item on the build tab. Actually, I was doing a little bit of testing with custom forms earlier, so I'm going to delete that and kind of start things from scratch. So I'm going to delete the form here. We'll come back over to this in just a minute. I do want to show the build action before we get started though. So really super simple. This is really centered around capturing inputs from the end user as part of the action, and then logging those inputs in the order as it goes through. Really, this particular video doesn't center around what to do once you've captured those inputs. But I think part of the challenge that you can have in an automation initiative is capturing the inputs in an appropriate way to make them scalable, to make them reusable, to make them as flexible as you need them to be for a particular use case. Anyway, let's go ahead and we're going to, so we have our action here. Our action has those two inputs. If we go over and look at the plugin itself, we will see that, there we go. There's our two inputs, which created those input parameters there. I am also going to, actually the other thing I'll point out, I think one of these inputs I set to a different type. So input 1 is just a string, but input 2 is a Boolean. And the reason that I'm pointing this out is as you create a default custom form for your blueprint, it is going to pull in the type that is set inside of CloudBolt and pass it over to the custom form. Actually, you know what? I'm going to do something a little bit different here. I'm going to add in an input 3 because I want to see how this behaves. Actually, why don't we call this password, and you'll see why. I want to make that a password field here. I'm going to add that in my plugin. Going to refresh. Okay, that password input parameter is now created. So I need to set the type to a password type. And that's going to encrypt that password that we're capturing from the end user, put some stars over it and make sure that we're not passing all of those or allowing those things to be visible. Okay, so we have 3 different types: of string, a Boolean, and a password in our build item. I'm going to refresh just to be sure that this blueprint is up to date with what's going on in the actions. Now I'm going to go over to my custom form tab, and this is really where we start working with custom forms. I can generate default form. So, and this is where we do auto-generate the default form in CloudBolt. We'll read and parse those actions, and we'll pull in the relevant details from them to create inputs inside of a custom form. So a couple of things going on here. We do have a designer, a preview, a logic, and a JSON editor tab. The designer tab is where we would build out our custom form. So by default, we have this order details, which always has blueprint ID and group associated with this tab. These are required because with custom forms, this is really an overlayment in CloudBolt. It, on the back end, when you press submit, is sending a REST request to your blueprint in CloudBolt. So we need to tell CloudBolt what group this is being submitted for and what blueprint ID we're attempting to submit. Without these things, we can't do things like role-based access control and things that we want to be sure are in place inside of the system. We don't want to circumvent controls inside of the blueprint for role-based access control. So these two are on every single blueprint. They are also members of a default page called Order Details. I could change that page title and call it, let's see, am I clicking in the wrong place? I should be able to change that page title. There we go. It's over here. So I can call it next test order. We can change the name of the overall form. We can call this one maybe custom forms blueprint. Not sure what happened. My system just jumped around real quick. Okay, custom forms blueprint, and then description. This is my description. It looks like our keyboard shortcuts are capturing my, maybe I'm hitting multiple keys at once. So this is my description. So we can put some custom text. We can click on this icon. It will allow us to upload a different icon for the form than what's on the blueprint. So that's one potential possibility there. You also see when we get down to page 2, this is the custom forms action. So it creates a separate page, I believe, for every build item on the canvas. We can relabel the page 2, and maybe this is, blueprint inputs. And you'll notice input 1, input 2, and password. One of the things I will call out, input 2 is already set to a type of Boolean. It knows that because it parsed our parameter from our action, and it's going to set that type in here. And we hover here. You can select, you could even change this if you wanted to. I would recommend sticking with what we set by default, but we now have a Boolean value here, and we can use that to set things, to set yes or no values. Input 1, this is a text field. So we can change this to validate different types, whether it's a text or phone number, email address, a lot of common regex validations that we might be doing against what we're capturing from the user. So this is a handy feature here. And then single input, this would allow me to change, again, the type of the box. Maybe I want to make input 1 a drop down versus a standard string. We can do that. And we'll come back to this in just a minute. But let's go back to single input for now. When we go down to the password field, again, it's still a single input. So the field is the same. The only difference is that the type is a little bit different. It's a password type, which allows us to treat it a little differently than other field types. So that's kind of the big thing here. We'll get into some of the field nuances and things along those lines. I want to finish kind of talking through these other tabs here. The next tab is our preview. So we can actually go through and preview like we would submit a version of this form. Input 1, I can put in a value. Input 2, I can select yes. I can put a password in my password field. You'll notice that we obfuscate that. We don't actually show the value there. We're going to mask the value so that you don't have people shoulder surfing and seeing what you're typing in as a password. So that's what this form would look like. This preview tab is really helpful. We'll be coming back and forth between this as we're building this custom form out. The logic tab, I'm not entirely certain what that's leveraged for. I don't really see anything on there. Haven't had a chance to dig into it anymore. But this is something that's Survey.js specific. Since this is all Survey.js under the covers, I assume that you could go to their documentation, get a little more information there. The one other piece I will point out is the JSON editor. This JSON editor allows you to store your forms as code. So you can come in, if you wanted to, you can edit these in accordance with Survey.js's standards for a JSON payload for a custom form, and you could re-upload a new custom form if you wanted to. So programmatic control over custom forms as well. And these can be exported to store and source control, those kinds of things. So back over to my designer for now. So let's take a look at just in the UI what this looks like to work with these the input parameters a little bit. So one of the things I will point out, each of these forms, depending on what type is selected here, you're going to have different things that you can do for that field in this edit pane over to the right here. We may want to make a field read only, and that's handy. By default, CloudBolt, if you're using or leveraging the out of the box forms in CloudBolt, you don't really have a good way to set a value for a field and make it read only so that the end user sees what was set for that field, but they're not able to influence what it was. But it may be good for them to understand what that value is. So this is handy. There's two ways that I've used this before. One is this, if I'm dynamically generating a value. So that might be pull a value from a different field, or two fields, and concatenate them together and make one overall value from the results of two separate fields. I am going to set this to read only for now. The other that I see probably more often would be just again a read only field where we show them what this is going to be, but I can type in test 1. And now what happens when I go to look at my form, the user should see test 1. It should be grayed out. They shouldn't be able to influence that or change it. We go over to our Blueprint Inputs tab. So see, they see what input 1's going to be sent as, but they're not able to change that value. So that may be handy for a user experience, from a user experience aspect. So you can change that. It's one helpful tip. I want to leave. I want to go back to my designer. The other thing we can do, these can be reordered. So I can shift, maybe I want to shift this to the first page. So take input 1, put it up here with my first page. Now I have input 1 will be captured on the same page as my group dropdown. So a little bit of flexibility as far as, we're capturing this information. You can put it wherever you want. Maybe you want everything to include the group selection to all be on one single page, so a single form submit. The other thing I like, and this is just our default forms in CloudBolt, they take this approach to a single width field, which I guess is okay, but to me, there's a ton of real estate over on the left and right hand side if I'm using this form from a desktop. So one of the other things that I'm a big fan of in custom forms is taking, and I'm going to move my input 1 back down with my page. I'm going to take input 1, and then I'm going to go through and I'm going to set this as, if I can remember where it was at, I'm going to collapse general. I believe it was under logic. Oh, logic is handy. So this is a good example. While we're here, then we'll come back to the other example in a minute. But logic, maybe I put input 1 before input 2, and I can say that input 1 is only visible if, and there's a wizard button here that we can select to take us to a wizard that will allow us to tell us which field we want to reference. In this case, I want to reference input 2. And then I want to say input 2 equals no, then I want to show this field, or vice versa, right? So, if input 2 equals yes, then I want to show this field. So this now, I'm not going to show that read-only value that we set on that first value until someone selects yes for input 2. So now we're showing that field, or no, we're not going to show that field. So giving you control, or the ability to control the behavior of one field by referencing another. And that's not just with Boolean values. I believe we can do that with strings as well, where you look for, if the string equals A, B, or C, we want to show it. But if not, we want to mask that field from the end user. So giving you the flexibility to do that. What's also handy here is the wizard will show you how to build that logic out. And this goes the UI is extremely flexible with Survey.js, but it does go quite a bit deeper. There's a bunch of features that aren't even available in the UI that you can add as part of the JSON editor capabilities. It's an extremely powerful capability. So I'm going to remove that visible if. We could also do like editable if, required if. These are all conditional logic statements to define how we want our field to behave. I'm going to collapse that for now. I'm going to go ahead and go over to data. It's not what I was looking for. I'm looking for something very specific. Maybe it was under general. What I'm trying to do is, I don't like this real estate, the way that it's set up here. Maybe layout. There it is. So display question on a new line. if input 1 is deselected to say display question on a new line, notice it pops up and can be displayed with input 2. Now, where this really becomes handy is if we're building forms that we want to be able to be submitted from either CloudBolt, or via web browser on a PC or a mobile application. What happens now is I have my preview, and then if I go over to my next screen, you'll see that these parameters are now taking a little bit more advantage of my real estate across the entire screen. The password field was kind of expanded to match my formatting here. But the other thing that I like about this, let's see if I can get this to, oh, there we go. So if we shrink the screen and then we shrink the screen down, let's say a little bit further. Hang with just a second. Shrink this down just a little bit further to where those fields shouldn't be taking up the entire screen. It actually wraps those fields and it makes it more friendly for a mobile type view. So just a little bit of kind of a hidden functionality there where we can take advantage of a wider field if needed. But if not needed, we don't, we'll optimize the real estate on the screen based off of the screen width that we're working with. I'm actually going to do the same thing with password and allow that to be displayed in the same line so that we should have all three fields. In this instance, they should all be across from one another. There we go. Again, if we shrink this down a little bit, you'll see that they're in line from top to bottom. The user can go through and fill those out in a manner that makes sense. So self-organizing fields inside of here. We'll go ahead and maybe revert one of those, maybe the password field. There we go. Notice parent page too. So I could also switch to a different page here from the layout section. Again, I'm a big fan of single page order forms. It reduces complexity and I don't like when the user has to go through multiple pages, but I also don't like when they have to scroll for miles to get to a value. So there's a couple of the things that we can do here. Let's just kind of pick through our default. If I could drop that correctly. Put input 1 back in first position, redisplay input 2 on its own line. The other thing that we can do here, I'm going to turn off read only on input 1. So disable read only, and then I'm going to go ahead and actually I'm going to change the type. I don't want this to be a single input anymore. I want to make this a dropdown. And in my dropdown, I want to say that I want to pass over these specific values. Notice when I click item 1 in my list here, it brings up a table of choices that these choices represent on the left-hand side. I would think it would tell you, but it doesn't. Anyway, I know this, so I'll explain it here. The choices to the left-hand side, this is the value we're going to pass to the database. So this could be value _1, while value 1 would be this is value 1. And what happens is the user is going to be presented with this is value 1. But when we pass this back to CloudBolt, it's going to be passed as value _1. So it gives us a way to submit database values without the user actually seeing the database value. Just again, this is all user experience oriented and making this the most easy to understand user experience for the customer that's submitting this. So now when we go to look at our preview, what you'll notice is that we have a drop down that shows, this is value 1, value 2, value 3. Now what's interesting is input 1 is showing test 1 as a default value. So that's not quite what I would like to see. Let's see if we can figure that out. Oh, you know what that is? That's the default value. So remember I set up a default value for my single input before I switch the type. So it's going to carry that default over. So we need to make sure to reset that. So I can recall where what's under data. There we go. Change default answer. I'm going to clear the default answer. And now we shouldn't see test 1 in the form anymore. So go back over to preview. Get past this page. I may move everything to page 1 so I don't have to keep clicking IT. There we go. So now it's telling me to select. This is value 123. The other handy thing here is we can actually change this helper text. Select is just the default. So if I wanted to change that helper text from select, instead of input area placeholder being select, it would be select your value. Now, if we go again back over to our preview, we can get over to the second page and see it now says select your value. So a lot more control over how we're presenting those to the end user, making the user experience for ordering items from the CloudBolt catalog more intuitive and designed in a way that really meets your organization's requirements. I think we'll cover off more around customization here and some additional options that are available as part of each of these. Like I said, the big thing to remember here is make sure that your type is set correctly. And there's a lot of really good types here. You can also duplicate this, do those kinds of things. Required can be toggled here. Oh, look at that. It changes the checkbox off and on. I think that's a newer feature versus older versions that I've worked with. But then we have over here on the right-hand side, the other thing I will point out, I did not show this yet, but input mapping. So as we go through and pull those items in from our blueprint, you'll notice that this is actually referencing a particular tier for my blueprint. So this WIEJFSY, this is the ID for my server build item. So let's go back over and just show you how you would reference that. If we go, oh, there it is. It's right there. So the API key is right here. So if you needed to add an additional field, or maybe you generated a default form, but you added a new input and you don't want to rebuild the entire form, you can come in and copy this API key and go back over to your custom form. You can name it with the form ID dot whatever parameter we're trying to populate in CloudBolt here. So that will be one way to do input mapping in CloudBolt. You can, and then you handle the logic with the rest of this field. So poke through these selections, see what's out there. There's a lot of things in here that make this very, very flexible. Even validation is handy. You probably want to go through and make sure that your users are prevented from making errors. You can put in custom required error messages, all of those kinds of things. They're all baked in here. So again, extremely flexible way to handle custom forms for your blueprints in CloudBolt. I will point out one other thing. I actually want to submit this blueprint just to show how these values are captured and passed over. Let's go ahead and say, don't forget to save your form, because you can make all your edits. And one of the things we'll do here, if I edit this and I don't save it and I go to leave the blueprint altogether, it's going to warn me because I now have unsaved changes in that form. So it does help you a little bit, but I would be sure to save that every time you make a change, just to be sure that those changes are updated and reflected in your form. Now let's go over to the overview tab. We're going to order this blueprint. And we're just going to watch to see what the submission process looks like. So again, very similar to that preview that we looked at before. But let's do, this is value 2. Let's do input 2, yes, and then password. We'll pass in that password field. Now, one of the things that you will want to be careful with, actually, I didn't print the password. So that's very interesting. It took me right on back to, oh, I hit previous. I didn't hit submit. Order is what I was looking for. So that's, to me, it makes more sense to maybe call this button submit, and we can change that in the blueprint. I just kept clicking previous, but let's hit order. Your order is being processed. It's submitting the order. So it's making the REST call to order that blueprint. Then we get your traditional CloudBolt order screen. And in the order screen, what you will see is just a couple of logs that are printing out those values we captured. I didn't print input 2, and I shouldn't log input, or it was our password input. You don't want to log password inputs, because once they hit CloudBolt, before you've stored them in some other encrypted field, they're getting passed via REST call without any kind of encryption. We need to be able to pass it into the REST API. So before this hits, I definitely would be careful not printing any password type fields. But we can see that the blueprint is functioning. I can take those values and take some kind of action inside of extensibility with those values. Okay, let's head back over to our blueprint. So the next thing that we're going to take a look at here is how do we generate options? And we looked at the static options already inside of our custom form. But I mean more along the lines of how do we generate dynamic options? So let's take a look at generating dynamic options inside of a custom form. So back over to our custom form tab. Let's do it for maybe input 1. There's a couple of ways that we can do this. Like I mentioned, static options we looked at before, but we can also do, so let's look at choices here. We can copy choices from another question. So you can pull in the same choices from a different question. You can sort your choices. You can select, either ascending, descending, or random. You can allow the user to select other, which would open up the field to allow them to type in what they need, or none. They could also select none as a viable option that would pass back none to the system as part of the REST call. So all other options that are available when we're talking about drop-down values, clear would allow them to clear their choice. Let's see. Really, I think what we want to focus on here, though, is choices from a RESTful service. And this is going to be the ability to send a REST call from the form at the time that the user is doing something inside of the form. And that REST call can also reference different fields. So if you remember a little earlier, we were using that single curly bracket notation to specify, maybe I want to reference my group. So if I have some kind of REST call that I want to make here, and I want to call it against an endpoint, and I want to pass my group to that endpoint to get a list of responses from that call, I can do that. Get values from the following JSON field and get display text from the following JSON field. What this, I believe the syntax this is expecting in a return is a list of things that are returned back, but that list could be a list of dictionary objects. So, or JSON objects, I guess would be more appropriate. But we can reference, like, maybe the name field is the JSON field we're trying to pull the value from, but maybe the display text is going to, maybe we have a label field for that particular option that we're going to allow them to select. So this allows you to really target a REST service, and we'll go through this here in just a second. I just had one other suspicion that I wanted to go through. I don't know that it's possible the way that I was hoping. Choices are visible if, choices are selectable if. Actually, you know what? I'm going to see if I can edit value. There we go. So that's what I was looking for. We can even make our choices. So I'm a big fan. I do a ton with code, but whenever possible, I try and find a more straightforward answer. And this is just within these choices, I can say, let's go back to our input 2 field. Let's say that if input 2 is true, I'm going to put that back up above input 1 again. So I'm going to come back over to input 1, and I'm going to say, I want to hide value 1, or this is value 1. Let's say it's visible when input 2 is yes. So if input 2 is no or not selected, it's not going to be visible at all. But once we select yes, that option should show in our dropdown. So let's go over to our preview tab. Let's get over to the next screen. And then you can notice this is value 1 is not in the option list. But if we click yes, now value 1 shows in the option list. So that's a really easy way to build a dynamic list based off of conditions on other elements inside of your form. I would certainly keep that in mind, but I think really where we want to head now is to walk through an example with the choices from a RESTful service option. For generating options, we're going to reference this a little bit to go through There's a couple of options that we have when doing this in our custom forms. The documentation calls them out pretty good. The first option is going to be, it says two main options here. I'm going to throw a third one into the pot. The first option is leveraging an inbound webhook to return responses, where you can write a custom plugin code to generate the options, or we can use a generate options for function in your build item plugin code, which is really handy because we have these items and we can generate those options as part of the plugin code. So we'll kind of run through. Let's start with maybe the generate options option to start, and then we'll take a look at maybe inbound webhooks, which are take it to another level. As well as you can also, the third option that we probably won't cover here, but if there is a way for you to invoke an API with some kind of token inside of the API, you can take this and make this a little more flexible. And as part of this service URL, if you can pass a token in there, you can set that up to store it inside of your custom form and then invoke the service on the back end. You could also potentially pass that token in from another field, something along those lines. So a lot of flexibility here. Let's go ahead and take a look at the generate options for, we'll pick one of these values. Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong blueprint. I switched over. Okay, so we are looking for custom form. Here's my custom forms blueprint. We're going to go ahead and edit. Take a look at our build tab, and here's my action. I'm going to jump over into my code editor, and we're going to make our changes here. Okay, so our three inputs back to input 1, input 2, password. Why don't we go ahead and do, I'm going to do a def and generate options. We go for input 1. Return option 1, option 2, option 3. So let's save that here. And I'm curious to see if it actually pulls this in and pre-populates this for me. So using this generated options plugin for me. So I'm going to go back to my form. And again, you probably don't want to do this if you have a functioning form, but this is just kind of a test instance. So I'm going to regenerate my default form, and I'm hoping that it pulls the API to make those calls in without me having to do really anything else at all. It's aligned a little funky. There we go. Input 1. Now notice input 1, it did regenerate it, and it does have it selected as a drop down, which is different, right? Option 2 is still set as a Boolean because that was my type. Option 3 is still set as a password. So we're still recognizing those types. And then I want to go choices from RESTful service. Fantastic. So look at that. It is pulling in the options from the parameter here. Now, the other thing that I saw somebody else do is leverage, you know what, this is the same thing. So I was wrong there. But I have a suspicion here, and we'll test this theory in just a second. But right now what it's doing is it's taking in it's setting this up to just generate those options for me. Now, there are, if you look at the documentation, there are also ways that we can pass additional information about this resource in that URL. So there are some advanced option inputs in the documentation. If you needed to capture data like my input and you wanted to pass that into your parameter generation, you can. So you can take that data, make some decisions around how you're going to return the output, and then you can return that back to the user. Okay, so now that we've added our service URL here, or excuse me, the default form imported it for us, we can go to our preview and let's just check to be sure that those values are populating from my generated options plugin. And option 1, option 2, option 3, that's not quite was, actually, I think that was, I don't even remember what we did here. Yeah, option 1, option 2, option 3. So it's now, and this is really interesting because what's happening here is this is passing in let's see if I can get back over to my form. It's passing in, this is making a REST call from this form. It's taking the group, injecting the group into the call, and then it's returning a list of options based off of that. So let's take this one step further. Again, this is my first time kind of messing with this. So I'm going to actually tail my application log because I want to see what we're getting in the payload when we submit this. So let's do a logger.debug. There we go, generate options for input 1. I don't have a logger method yet, so I'm going to steal that from another sample. Let's see, I'm sure I'm doing it here somewhere. It's kind of my default logger statement here. Okay, so now we've instantiated logger, so we can call that. We're going to print out kwargs. I want to make sure that group is getting passed in, then we'll maybe play around with a couple of different things here. So let's do there we go. All right, so that is pulling that information in. Okay, so now we're tailing our log. I like to knock this down a couple of lines just to be sure that we know where we started, so we're not getting conflicting information. But I do want to change my script real quick. We're going to get our kwargs. So all I should have to do now is go back, flip to my designer view, flip back to preview. I'm hoping this refreshes. If not, maybe we need to refresh the entire thing. Okay, option 1, 2, 3. Let's go over to our print statement. I don't think it pulled in my updated custom forms action, so I'm going to save that again just to be sure. I'm going to go to my build tab. See, so it doesn't have my generate options. It didn't pull it in. So sometimes a refresh on the blueprint will pull in the updated. There we go. That's what we're looking for. So back over to my custom forms. Back to preview, select my group. Go next, and we should see our kwargs getting printed out now. Okay, that's better. So let's see, generate options for input 1 kwargs. So we're getting the field that was submitted for. Environment wasn't passed in. So there are some default things that we can pass over as well. Things like environment, group, blueprint. So I could pass over my blueprint ID, which I think we have in there as well. So let's just add that to our payload and see what that looks like. Yeah, I got to select my input 1. We're going to come down here and edit our RESTful service URL here. And we're going to do, I believe an ampersand should do the trick. And what was I trying to add? Group. And it is late on a day. It's late in the day on a Friday. So I think I'm running out of steam here. Let's see, blueprint is what we're passing over. So back over to, I keep going to the wrong page. And blueprint, and we're going to do equals, let's do blueprint underscore ID, I think is how we should reference that, but we'll find out. And this is probably, you know what, I'm going to do this in the JSON editor. It's probably easier that way anyway. So let's go over here. Let's see, we have our, there we go, blueprint ID. This is just a little more straightforward, and I can actually copy my field name from here to know that I can have the exact field name and just paste that in. So we should see our blueprint ID getting passed in. Let's see, that should hopefully do the trick. Let's save our form. Let's preview and hope that gets us additional information. I'm going to knock this down a couple of lines first before you input this and go to the next page. There we go. Now we should see additional logs. There we go. So we've passed in our blueprint. Oh, so what's really interesting is we passed in a blueprint ID, but it actually pulled the blueprint object. So that's kind of cool. It's same for the group. I believe we're passing in the group ID, but it's actually parsing that to find the appropriate ID. Now, the last thing that I want to try and do is go back to the documentation, because what if we want to pass additional information in here? Like I want to look at my Boolean value and make a determination off of that. So the last thing we can also pass in is this inputs. And I'm going to use this. And I think that from what I suspect will happen is that we can use this inputs field to pass in a dictionary of different entries to this form. Oh, back to my JSON editor. So let's go down here. We're going to pass in inputs, and I'm going to say equals, and let's say input underscore 1. Actually, what was my Boolean value for input 2? Let's pass this guy in. We're just going to pass the value for this in. We'll call this input 2. And we'll say, I believe, let me check my syntax. Okay, so we can't do quotes in there. We're doing quotes in there, and then is it a colon or equals? A colon. So that's okay. And then we're going to paste this in. We're going to pass this as a templated value. So it should go through and parse this. What I find interesting is we're able to do these curly brackets and it's not choking on that. Maybe because of the way that it's formatted, I would assume. Okay, and we have quotes here to begin and end the URL. So I assume we're doing something here to escape that in the URL. So let's give it a shot and see if we're able to get that input 2 in there. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do a second input because I'm curious. Let's do new value, and we're just going to call this test. So see if we're getting both of these values passed in. And it doesn't like something about that. Oh, I know what I did. Oh, I think we probably want, because this is, since I'm editing the JSON now, I think we want to escape those. There we go. So it accepts it now, but let's see if our designer sees it that way too. A couple ways to go about this. Why am I? Oh, there it is. Okay, so yeah, it pulls it in. It reads that appropriately. So I think that's how we want to go about this. Let's give it a shot. Let's hope this works. Okay, so I'm going to knock my log down a couple of lines first. Back over to my blueprint. No data to display, and that's okay. It probably choked on something. Apparently it did nothing. So that's different. It's not quite what I was expecting. Maybe I went a little too far on this one. I'm going to try and edit it in the UI versus the JSON editor here. So let's give that a shot in the designer itself. I may actually I'm going to copy this just to be sure I'm not messing anything up. And inputs. I'm going to see if I can get a static input first. So I'm not going to pull anything in quite yet. I missed it. We'll do my input and then test. I just want to make sure it's getting passed. And that'll test my syntax. I gotta go next. I believe I don't think that renders it until we get to this page. I still think something's messed up because we should be seeing something in these logs at this point. Okay, so after a little bit more digging and checking with one of the developers who wrote this feature, I'm really not sure what I did wrong. I'm pretty sure this is very similar to what I did the first time, but I have my inputs now. Maybe we'll try and pass both of these in now, but so it's still just at the end and ampersand inputs, and then I have my brackets around my input, and my input is being passed the value of that, the input 2 parameter there. So let's see. Okay, so let's just show that working now. Let's go back over to our preview just to prove that I'm not just making this up. Let's knock our log down a few lines. We'll go ahead and select our group. Click next, and we should, now one of the things to notice is it doesn't actually regenerate these options until all of the survey.js parameters have a value selected. So if we go and look now, there's nothing there because we're looking for blueprint ID, we're looking for group, and we're also looking for input 2. So now that I select input 2 though, I can go back over. Maybe I need to deselect that field. You know what, I also ran into some things. I think when I haven't refreshed, it's not going to show those log entries either. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to refresh that page. I'm going to retail my log. We're going to start from scratch. Let's try it one more time because I did get it working. And you notice the drop down was showing there a second ago. So there's IT. And again, input 2, we do want to select a value for, come back over to our form. You know what I may have missed? I don't know that I saved my form, and it probably, you may have even seen this on the video. Maybe it warned me and I ignored that. But input 2 was above input 1 just a second ago. So I'm suspecting that that's what I did. Let's go to input 1. Yeah, so it took that value out. So I'll just walk you through the process of what I did. I kind of have my input there still. Then if I go to input 2, I can capture the name of this parameter from the top. And I can jump back over to input 1. And on input 1, go to my choices from a RESTful service, go to the end. And in my input, I can pass in that templated value. So now we should be able to go over to the preview, select my group, go next. Now input 2 is at the top. Let's just verify, get us some new log entries there. Let's select input 2. Man, that was a lot of fun, wasn't it? Anyway, this is in the documentation, but we do take that entire dictionary in. We will, or survey.js actually parses that value, so it's pulling in the value for value 2 or whatever that field is called, and it's passing it in as a dictionary that we can then work with inside of our automation. So allowing you to pass these parameters into your generated options plugin. So really, really handy. We can take that then. Actually, let's do this. I like examples, but let's say if let's actually say, let's get my input. So my underscore input equals quarks.get, and it's going to be API underscore SI underscore data. So just showing you how to work with this a little bit. And you could with quarks.get, I could give it a default, like if this doesn't get set, like an empty string or a none. I don't really care about that. You could also raise an error if this isn't passed in. So why don't we do that? So let's say, let's do, if not, actually, let's do that. Yeah, let's do this because now we have this dictionary, and I believe that's just a string, but I'm not 100%. So I'm gonna log. No. I want to log my input, and then I want to log the type. So there we go. We're not going to do anything else with it yet. I don't really care about this. We're going to get rid of that. Just again, I'm not entirely sure the format that we're sending this as, but this is, again, this whole series was around not just building this content, but also the process to see how to work with it, how to troubleshoot this, how to get it to work in your environments. So I want to make sure this is valuable. Okay, switch my group a little bit. Come back over. I'm going to select input 2, change that value real quick. So we should see now, there we go. So class, it is a dictionary. So we can start working with this the way that it is. We don't have to parse that. It's not a JSON string. So that's helpful. Little, one line less code that we have to work with. So let's do now, we'll call it my_input equals, let's actually call this the API SI data. And then my input equals, there we go. So now we should be able to get my input. I don't really care about the type of my input because we know that it's going to be a single string. And we should see that in the log entry. So we're going to save that now. Should be able to go back over to custom forms action, maybe just toggle this. Let's see how that functions. There we go. My input equals false. And if we go up, we should see my input equals true. Actually, let's toggle that one last time. We should see it flip over to true. There we go. My input equals, oh, I think I need to go back and reset things. Let's go back to previous. Let's set this to a different group. Go to the next form. There we go. Okay. Not sure what that was doing while I was toggling. Interesting. My input false. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, you know what? Syntax will get you every time. I need to watch for these underlines here. GitHub Copilot didn't catch it. I blame GitHub Copilot. Totally the AI's fault. Yeah, I'm gonna have to, just gonna re-trigger this whole thing, go back to the primary screen, change my group, go back over, input no, input yes. Still can't tell if it's happy with me or not. Just gonna refresh. Sometimes that action, the generated options action, nope, I don't want to do that. I want to save my form. I'm going to go to my build tab, just make sure that this is forced to refresh. Okay, there we go. That should give us everything we're looking for now. If we go back to our custom form, let's go ahead and preview, select the information that we need. Yes. We do see drop downs, which means that we are returning it now. So that's a good start. There we go. My input is true. And I'm wondering if we toggle it, if we'll get the false. Let's go back. There we go. My input equals false. Perfect. So we can see that it's flipping back and forth as we change values that this field is dependent on. Let's do this now because we have my input. Let's say if my_input equals, let's just say if my_input, because true would render to a true statement. Let's do let's just give it a couple. Okay, and then we can do just an else statement. Actually, we'll just have our default where false is always option 1, 2, or 3. But if true, it's going to return it's true. It's all true. Give us 2 different options, just a way to parse that information and show different results inside of the UI. So I am going to refresh this just in case, just to be sure we're getting the latest version of that plugin. Because if not, we're just going to spin our wheels. There we go. So our statement is there now. We should be able to go over to our custom form and preview. This preview feature I'm finding to be really handy as we're building this out, right, versus having to go back and notice there's no options right now, but let's do yes. It's true. It's all true. No, option 1, 2, 3. So dynamic option generation, that's actually a really speedy response time too, to go back and forth between the two. I mean, it's almost near instantaneous. By the time I'm clicking the next field, it's returning those really quickly. So pretty cool stuff. Yeah, so dynamically generated options using those generated options plugins. The other thing that was pointed out to me just a minute ago that I think we're going to cover off real quick before we get into some of the validation portion is the if there's a regenerated option dependency when we're building this default form, that it will actually pass that into the plugin. So that's usually where we see, I just built my own generated options dependency here with input 2. But what I'm going to do here in a second is I'm going to go through and say, so this could be interesting because normally generated options, I'm going to do, let's just take a stab at this and see how this works. But I'm going to do generated options. I'm going to call this field, then not filed, field. Then I'm going to do the next one's going to be control value equals none, and then quargs. And I'm going to use this to regenerate options. So I'm going to say, if not control value, I'm going to return nothing because we don't want to return any responses without that control value in place. But if we get the control value, let's say, so this is going to be a little bit different than the example that we just went through, but we're going to say, we're going to use the same logic here, if my input, those kinds of things. But let's say, actually, this is not what we want to do because remember, actually, what we want to check for is control value equals to none, because if not, we'll also check for a false condition. This should do the trick. Or empty string. So I don't want either of those values passed in. So I'm going to check for both of those, but I don't want to check for false, which is normally I would just do if not. But since this is a Boolean value that we're checking, it's going to be a little different. So now I'm going to say if my input, because we already know it's not these, we're going to say it's true, it's all true. Or sorry, not if my input, but control value. And then we're also going to do a logger. I'm going to do this before we exit. Okay, so that should print our control value. That should do the trick. So this is, we're changing our generated options plugin a little bit. I'm actually going to, before we do anything, I'm gonna delete the form. I want to get rid of this, and I want to set this up to do our regenerated options the way that CloudBolt does it in the native forms. So we have our custom forms action here. I'm going to launch that in another tab. We're going to go into this plugin, and I'm going to set, so notice input 1 now has a generated options plugin on it. That's what the G notates. But I can also then go into input 1, and I can say that input 1 is going to have a dependency created to say, I want to point at input 2. Now I could do show, and we showed that in custom forms a little bit, which would be, especially since input 2 is a Boolean value. Anytime it's true, it would show it. Anytime it's false, it would hide it. But I want to do a regenerate options. And what that does is it will regenerate my options in input 2 whenever input 1 whenever the value for input 2 changes. So we're just going to take a look at that in the default CloudBolt form. Hopefully I didn't mess anything up there, but let's select my group. Then we can say, so false, option 1, 2, 3, true. It's true, it's all true. So same look and feel that we saw in the custom forms, but what I'm really wanting to show here, this again, super simple example. We're really focused on the input parameters here. But what I want to show here is coming back over to the custom form, we can regenerate the default form, and this should pull in those dependencies into the form. And I'm curious what that looks like. So I now have my new form generated. Let's go down and look at input 1. Notice it did respect my order. So I changed my order in my plugin. Input 2 is now above input 1. So that's interesting to me. But then we go into choices from a RESTful service, and let's see what this looks like. So n inputs equals an empty string. So I'm curious if this will work or not, but let's see what happens. I'm kind of skeptical here, but let's hope. Maybe I messed something up. I'm going to step away for a second, just see if I can validate this. Okay, so I'm being told that was a bug in our functionality here. So this is already fixed, and it should be included in the next release of CloudBolt. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to cover is going into some validation steps. You know, and you can, if we look at the documentation here, you can submit server-side validation using the standard order forms validation. So if you've built that into your blueprint, it will still validate the user form if you're using a blueprint validation orchestration action. So that's one option to handle validation. But there's also some options that are built into the Survey.js forms. And I think we started to look at this a little bit earlier, but we can handle some additional, so right here, this is only around a required error message. So we can give back a custom error message saying, please input a value or something to tell them that their input was incorrect. We can add additional validators here, whether that's an expression, and that validation expression can add additional error messages. So let's just take a look at this. Let's see. So input 1, if input 1 equals, or let's see. So we can validate this against other fields, which is kind of intriguing. And we could look at this versus some others. So let's say if input 1, let's say that it does not equal. And it's not going to pull them because I have drop downs on there. Maybe I just I'm going to change my type over from drop down to single input. That should change my options here, hopefully. Oh, this is better. So this is kind of what I was looking for because it was a drop down that wasn't available. So here's where validators can start to become a little more handy. So we can check the user's input to make sure that it matches some of these things. I think we saw earlier from a validation standpoint, there are some additional baked in commonly used type validators for like an email address or something along those lines, where we can say, let's make this an email and see what happens. But format. So let's see if we can get this to work. Let's go over to our preview. Let's check out our validator here and see if I don't input an email. Oh, it's got that custom validator built in. I don't think that takes account when we're using that single string, which is okay. I think that's a valid response. And I wonder what that looks like in the JSON payload. So I'm going to take a look at that real quick. I'm just curious. Yeah, so required error text. I don't know if there's a way to change that or not. But because we selected an input type of email, it's doing that validation for us. But if we needed to get outside of the box of what they're allowing us to do there, let's actually do this. I'm going to change this back to string. Was it a string? Was it a string? What am I missing here? Nope, not password. Text. Text is what we want. But let's just do regex for valid email. Let's see if we can find a good regex for this. And there's usually 5,000 posts around how to do valid regex for these kinds of things. So let's do, I also like to test this. Use regex 101 for that pretty often. Let's do, there's the regex. And then test string, I'm just going to do, okay, shouldn't validate here, but if I put an @ my pattern contains one or more errors, so that's interesting. Regex is not my friend. What is the pattern error? Assuming that's the same thing, but let's see. Oh, regex. How? I do not like you. Let's try this. Simple regex email validator. Perfect. 2008, which means it should be simpler than today, hopefully. Oh, okay. Okay, it matches now. It's not going to catch the comms and nets, but I don't really care. Now let's get rid of that. Now it doesn't match. So this does the job. This is really all I'm looking for today. I don't care about catching valid domains or any of those funny things, but this should do the trick just to show that we can hand back that custom error validation. So let's go back to our, instead of an expression, we're going to do a regex. Let's edit this. Regular expression. Oh, you know what? That was a required error message. So our regex validator, there's our regular expression, and then our error message is going to be, please enter a valid email address. You must at least try to enter an email address. Okay, so this required error message is when nothing's filled in. This is going to pop up the error message when regex does not validate that it's an email address. So let's try this real quick, and then we'll move on to hopefully our last two examples before we close out. So there's my group. Input 1, I'm going to put in everything except for input 1. I'm going to order. I must at least try to enter an email address. Now let's see. Regex failed. I need to enter a valid email address. And now the order submitted. So showing a couple of those inputs, the values that were selected for those. Now, that's kind of interesting. Not sure what happened here, but it certainly shouldn't be showing, especially like the password field. Not entirely sure what happened there, but I'm going to find out. So let's move on to the next thing, and I'll address this in the back end, and we'll get that fixed. Actually, you know what? I was just pinging somebody about that issue. It actually, if you remember, we were doing the custom form in the preview pane, and that's why it printed those results, is because as you're building this out, you may want to validate what those inputs look like. It didn't actually submit anything. It's just showing a preview of what it would submit to the system based off of what I typed in. So I'm going to just to show this actual behavior if we were to create this for real. Again, it's going to tell me you must at least try to enter it. I didn't answer my Boolean, so let's then pass in a value. And then we're going to do at. And we can order. Notice it does not print the survey results, but it doesn't like something here. It doesn't like. Oh, so remember I'm overwriting. So again, your blueprint action inputs and your custom form, they need to match types. So I tried to submit this, but because I didn't, the input one didn't let me pass it in because I still have in my blueprint plugin, it says that it's true and it's all true, should be the only values that are allowed. So it's not going to allow me to submit this, but that's okay. The point was more centered around validation versus actually getting to submit those things. So that is kind of a wrap on validation. The last thing that I want to cover are just two more advanced blueprints that a colleague of mine had put together and shared with me. One of them is a firewall form. And the thing that I like about this firewall form is what we call a dynamic matrix in Survey.js. So let's look at our custom form capability. I've used a similar function with customers when they're trying to input an unknown number of inputs, and there may be multiple different values that we would need to capture for every one of those inputs. So this dynamic matrix, which is what this is, or dynamic panel, excuse me, what this is it's a way to capture multiple sets of data and allow the user to add additional rows to this. Let's just show what this looks like, and then we'll dive in just a little bit deeper. So again, always the group, and then firewall information. But with firewall, I can put in my IP address, my port number, or range of port numbers, my destination. I can put all of those in here. And if I need to, I can add another row if I need to have valid values in here first, I assume. Actually, I don't know if they even need to be valid. I would assume, oh, yep, he's got validators on here and everything. So this is a well-built form. I can't even get past it to show what I want to do. And then destination 10.0.0.1/8, whatever. Then we can add new. So that's interesting. Okay, so it's still, it's kind of, there's this, the way that I've seen dynamic matrix work in the past is a little different. I like that way better because it presents a running table of entries. Whereas this will absolutely do what I'm trying to do here. But I'm going to remove the second option. This will allow me to do several different firewall rules, but I like to see them all next to each other. So maybe we take a crack at that real quick. Let's look at my designer. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to dynamic panel. Now, I think what I want here, though, is dynamic matrix. And a matrix, so a dynamic panel, what this allows me to, again, pass multiple values in, and this is rendered as I believe it's a list of dictionary entries, where in each of those dictionary entries you'd have the source, port number, the destination. You can parse them out, kind of loop through all of those. I'm going to add in another question here, though, and I'm not really going to do a ton with it other than do a dynamic matrix. I think this suits this kind of a purpose better, because notice now we have columns, and we can still put validation around each of these columns, but I can see all of my firewall rules under a single column. So let's just try to duplicate this. And then let's do port number. Then let's do destination. I'm not going to do all of the validation that is in place there. But I am going to show a little bit on each of these columns. So if I click the column header, you're going to see the cell type. So we can put that validation in here. Let's do, yeah, so we could do a drop down. We could do, I'm just going to do, instead of default, I could do single input, right? Let's do single input, because that's I think what we want to do there. But single input, then I can do input type. And I can check for, my scroll's not working today. I don't think we have CIDR built in here, or IP address, which would be handy because they're available in other places. Yeah, but we could put, I believe, yeah, so validators, I could still go through, since this is a string, again, assuming I can do a regex validation against the CIDR expression. So I could go through and validate that that works. Again, the purpose of this example is not to go through that whole process. Port number, again, I'm going to change, actually, I'm just going to change IP address back to default, and I'll show you a couple of the other things that I usually do here. I like to, first of all, each column, I do like to make each column required, because you're going to need this for a firewall rule. All three of these things are going to be required for each of these values for every row that we have in this table. And then I also like to do, I need to go back up to click on the matrix itself, and we should be able to do, there we go, row count. I'm going to say minimum row count is 1, maximum row count is 1,000. Row count 2 is what it starts with. I only want to start with 1 row. The user can always add extras, and maybe we limit them to 5 total rows for our firewall rules that we're trying to capture. So this should be enough to really just showcase the power of this dynamic matrix. You can also embed other rows underneath of this single row. So we've had customers that have do like CPU, memory, and VM name, and then a sub row to that would be disk. And you can go in and add additional disks for every virtual machine if you would like to do that as well. So just another example of how I've seen customers leverage this. Let's go over to the preview. Let's take a look at IT, our group. So here's the initial, remember, our firewall rule information, and this is okay. This still works. You're able to leverage that validation and everything else. But look at this. We have something that we can, I think you can put descriptions on these headers, maybe not. But if the description, I don't know, I think IP address, port number, destination are they're explicative enough, you know. Anyway, I can go through and say IP address. Actually, it gave me some values here by using that default option. I'm going to change that from default just real quick. And I think I know why we're seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is because honestly, I have no idea why we're seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But that's okay. We'll change it to single input. Port number, change it to single input. Destination, change it to single input. And let's go ahead and look at it one last time. I don't even need to do group. Yeah, so now we can type in our IP address, type in our port number, type in our destination. We can add additional entries to this really easily. And again, in the context of like a firewall rule, now I can view all of my port ranges and everything else that's associated with a single request in one easy to view console. They're all kind of lined up appropriately. I'm a big fan of the dynamic matrix, but what this will do, it will create a list of dictionary entries and pass that over to your plugin. You can then parse the data from each of those dictionary entries and create each of your firewall rules as needed. So gives you the capability. There's not a good way to do this out of the box in CloudBolt. So custom forms would be the way to go if you have a dynamic number of resources that you need to provision and different information you need to capture about each of those resources. Okay, one very last thing. I know this is getting to be a long one, but the last thing that I'll go through is this multiple servers example. So this is actually an example that we'll call another CloudBolt blueprint. But what we've done is we put together a plugin that will submit a REST call for those other servers. And I'll just show you what the form looks like. We'll run through that real quick. Part of what this does is it will go through, I believe this is, so these are other individual fields. We've set them as a third width so that you have 3 fields across one another in the form. Customer A, customer B, but really where we're performing the magic here is under this multiple servers section. You can query the environment for each of the servers that you're doing. Now, again, realize that we are doing a dynamic panel, but we could also potentially leverage a dynamic matrix here. Dynamic panel may make a little more sense because the servers, we're capturing a lot more information for each one of these. But this would be one way to allow your customers to order an indeterminate number of servers, and each of those servers could have a different spec to it. So one server could have 1 CPU, the next one could have 16. That would allow you to customize those order forms. The other thing about this is if you're taking this approach to ordering multiple servers, you end up, every one of your servers gets their own order. And what that allows you to do is to track all of the servers within their own life cycle versus, tracking them as a group, where we can allow customers to do like a count on a single server tier item. And that would build multiple servers with all of the same exact specs. But in the case of maybe building bulk servers for a single project, this might be a little more usable. It also compartmentalizes all of the orchestration actions, everything else that happens with every single individual server from a logging perspective. So it should keep all of those compartmentalized so that you can trace things down a little easier. So that's about all that we're going to cover on custom forms for now. I'm sure that we may even add some additional smaller videos to this in the future, but hopefully this was helpful. This concludes another video in the How Do I Do Something in CloudBolt video series. If you've made it this far, congratulations. Some of these can get to be a little bit lengthy. If you have any questions at all regarding anything that we've covered today, or really just anything about CloudBolt in general, please reach out to your account team. We're happy to cover any questions you may have. And we're always looking for additional ideas to cover as part of this series. So please reach out to your account team. Let us know how we can help you. And happy automating with CloudBolt.